We have 11 Palestinian names. Each had a hand in planning Munich. You're going to kill them, 11 men, one by one. They're all in Europe now. You'll stay there as long as it takes. Europe only, not the Arab countries.
I have to say, the minute we realized this movie was going to take place in the 70s, that was the good news and the bad news, because I think a lot of us, certainly who, were growing up in the 70s, we realized that there's aspects of that period that were a little, they were unattractive, let's put it that way. They were just, awkward fashion and hair and all that kind of thing. And if it's not done right, it can look like a costume. And the 70s in Europe was actually quite different than the United States. And it comes through in a very understated, realistic way, because Steven kept emphasizing how realistic he wanted the movie to look.
When I first started the movie, the idea that Steven wanted to pursue was literally going to the real locations where some of these events happened, some of the assassinations and the killings, as well as Munich, the Olympic Village. None of those places proved to be places that we could actually go and film for a wide variety of reasons. And so we really began looking at a way of making the movie that would allow us the maximum use of a few locations that we would make them into 14 different countries, which is why we picked Malta and Budapest primarily to film in.
We kind of went to these different countries and used them as Hollywood backlots. I mean, Malta substitutes for, Cyprus, Nicosia. It's Athens, Greece. Part of it is Rome, Italy.
While Zaid is here, in Rome.
It's certainly Tel Aviv in Israel.
Who kills the targets?
You do. Who else?
Malta is Beirut, Lebanon.
And action!
Malta served, many purposes. Budapest, on the other hand, was truly a backlot. By walking 2 blocks, the architecture changed from Romanesque to Parisian. And then you go back 3 or 4 blocks, you find yourself in London, England. And we added a couple of those double-decker red buses. But aside from that, I think Budapest was our most successful country in finding a variety of international looks.
As it turned out, by going to Malta and to Budapest and then making those into the various locations, we found a way to unify an impressionistic look of that era. And then that starts to segue, I think, hopefully into the theme of the entire production design of the movie, which is everybody seeking a home.
Living human beings are being held prisoner.
It's about the nations and the peoples, and then specifically the people that we follow, how they set up all these homes everywhere that they go, whether it's these safe houses that they go to, or trying, in Avner's case, to actually create a home, both in Israel and finally in Brooklyn.
Avner!
There's something that happens to a film as a family and as a unit shooting on location as opposed to being on a soundstage somewhere. That has a very, very tangible and visceral effect, which I love. It's my favourite way to work. You're in countries that have experienced incredible history themselves, and I think that always affects you. And visually, it was never forced or never fake. You were always somewhere that was legitimately 500 years old, or at least a few hundred years old. And whilst we cheated a few locations, but the architecture was never cheated, and things were always real, and it's great.
In Budapest, there are really very little soundstage facilities, and the ones that are there were being used, so we had to use a ice skating rink that was not being used as a place to build our sets. And so we commissioned some of the local set building companies to do various sets for us. And so they came in and did the actual building on the Frankfurt Safe House and also the Munich apartment, which is a set.
A man with a stocking mask on his face. Weird.
But some of the things we just couldn't get in those places.
I wanted some kind of iconography in the movie, so I bought a couple of days to go to Paris to shoot around the Eiffel Tower and some cafes and some streets. because I didn't want the audience to be looking in the background, searching for, is that really Paris? Is that really Germany? Is that really London? So I thought I could kind of throw everybody off by actually going to one of those countries and shooting there.
You can call me Louis.
We also had no way of getting a French farmhouse in Hungary. We finally went back to a place that we had seen on the first scout in 2004 outside of Paris, where we could find a kind of a compound where this a little bit of a Godfather type of figure that actually is in a sense pulling some of the strings as far as making the connections for this group and how they're going to find the people to assassinate.
We don't work with governments.
Louis said,
But you did what you did because you have to feed your family.
In the quest to find a home, Avner moves his wife and new baby to Brooklyn, which is like a new frontier, a place that he can actually then try to start a new life and leave everything that he's just been through behind him. And of course it follows him to some degree, and it's really not enough just to move to America, but it's interesting that we couldn't really replicate that in any other place. You had to go to New York and you had to go to Brooklyn in order to make that stand out and be something that you understood in the movie was different than all these other European locations that we'd been in, and that the light and the whole sense of what it would be to be there was somehow out of the battlefield, at least momentarily, of course, until our era.
This is Peter. Do you have something to report to us from where you are?
I mainly looked at old news footage of what the 70s really looked like, and that really informed Joanna Johnson and Rick Carter and all of us in how to really, make this as authentic to the 70s, early 70s, as we possibly could.
Joanna Johnson, the costume designer, had to do a tremendous amount of work to create not only the look of the era in one place or two places, but 14 places. 14 different types of versions of the early 1970s.
Stephen's brief was he just wanted it to look, completely real and believable, and it was a time in history that he remembered as a style, but he just wanted it not draw attention to itself as regards costumes. It would just pass before you.
The costumes that Joanna has done, they're remarkable because she's not defined people just who they are, it's about sort of how they think as well, not just about what they say, how they think.
It's strange, isn't it, to think of oneself as an assassin?
Think of yourself as something else then.
The hero 5 men, the characterizations in the book of Vengeance, they gave a very, very nice short list of things for me to draw on about how they were as people. And from that, then I, made their sort of look in their clothes and defined them away from each other, so they had their own identity.
I was really excited when I met with Joanna Johnson, the costume designer, and she ran through her ideas, and everything she chose was just brilliant.
Avner? Yes, we're going to Jerusalem, getting.
So Avner comes out of Israel, so when he comes out, he starts very, very warm. He's out of the military, so he's got a precision about him. He's very disciplined, he'd never want to draw attention to himself. So he's sort of low-key, but he looks very nice.
I like neat, durable men.
You like having the son of a hero around.
And as he goes through the mission, that order in his clothes starts to break up. So when he's in Northern Europe and he's really starting to lose it, he becomes much cooler. And then he takes on the mantle of being in a modern world, and he embraces the denim culture, first of all, which is also cool and modern. And also I thought it was a sort of slight homage to Steve. I felt that they had a really close bond at the end, being the sole survivors.
Are you sure it's him, Avner?
It seems to me the way Stephen's approaching it, the way he's filming things, and a lot of reflections, a lot of styles which maybe you've seen in films of the era, which I've always found incredibly stylish anyway. It's one of my favorite periods of movie making.
I keep talking. Ancora. Keep talking.
There were certain tools of the trade. Filmmakers used the zoom lens quite a lot in the 70s, and I decided, because I don't often use the zoom lens on many of my films, but I decided to probably use the zoom lens on this more than I've ever used it before in any film I've ever directed, because that was harkened back to the era where rather than dolly the camera forward, you just sort of reached out with the lens, which also gives you a sense of documentary. It gives you a sense of being there. And that turned out to be a wonderful technique to make you feel like you were not just a part of the 70s, but you were a part of an actual experience occurring right before your eyes.
What I usually do before we start the principal photography, I go and do extensive tests, photographic tests. Frequently, I will go to the location that we may photograph the movie. I went to Paris in 2004 and started experimenting with various color schemes, with various filters, lenses, and actually I shot in one location that we ended up photographing for Munich. I went to the lab, I manipulated the negative in the lab through photochemical processes, and then I made a little presentation to Steven. Basically, we were thinking of maybe pulling a little bit of the color out at certain scenes and introducing more colors at other scenes.
A little torture, and you'll see how nice they are.
Janusz actually had a different color for every country. He had a different palette for every country. It was actually very difficult for Janusz because we wanted to do something original to our story, and Janusz found ways of using bleach bypass in certain countries by actually pulling colors out of the sky, making the actual blue sky in Paris bluer than, let's say, it is in Malta. And he really worked hard to give each country a different color character.
Paris has different color scheme than Rome. Munich feels a little bit of different because of the light and color. So those are very subtle differences, but yet each of those particular countries has its own individuality. Because it's a suspense movie, it was also very, very easy to realize for cinematographer and for director, that creates great opportunity to stage the scenes in a very unusual way. For example, you will see that many scenes take place in the cars, simply because we're looking at hunters following the prey. So that creates a certain sense of suspense. We're using a lot of reflections, where you're seeing at people reflected in the cars, you're seeing people reflected in the glass, you're seeing people appearing from around the corners and disappearing behind the corners, simply because it's a suspense. The way Steven created certain scenes are just really amazing, because you see 3 shots and basically they convey the whole suspense, and he's using zoom, he's using extensive blocking. He's a very skillful director when it comes to camera and when in terms of creating the whole visual world just through camera.
Pull back. Oh, it'll be 2 zoom. He pull back just for a close-up. He turns into the close-up. He says, do it. Then we pull back a second time and focus to him, and he's got the box, and then we make this move here. We come right around like this to here, and bang, it doesn't work.
Cinematically, I just find it so dynamic, and it just was always serving our performances.
Am I being hunted?
And I just feel like we were so well supported by the visuals and by what Janusz and Steven were doing. And a lot of it's done with wardrobe, with Joanna Johnson, the costume designer, and Ricardo, the production designer. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And cut. Beautiful.